Number 1. Excalibur is probably one of the best known mythical swords in the Western world. The Lady of the Lake is said to have offered Arthur Excalibur sometime after he began his reign as king. She is also the one who is said to have named the sword. Some evidence suggests that King Arthur may have actually existed, but it's difficult to separate myth from legend. It's said that Joseph of Arimathea, the uncle of Jesus, fled Britain with the Holy Grail and founded the first Christian church on the ancient island known as Glass Isle, or Avalon, better known today as Glastonbury. Today, a plaque marks the spot where in 1191 AD, King Arthur's tomb was apparently uncovered by builders working on a restoration of an abbey after it had almost been completely destroyed by fire in 1184 AD, though it has never been proven that it actually was the legendary King Arthur. You probably already know that Excalibur was famous for being able to cut through other swords, but did you know Excalibur's scabbard was said to have powers of its own? For example, the bearer of the scabbard could not be killed by blood loss from injuries, and in some versions, wounds received by one wearing the scabbard did not bleed at all. Number 2. The Sword and the Stone. Some old stories say that the sword and the stone was Excalibur, but others disagree and state that it was an entirely different sword, which had no special powers except for the ability to choose the next rightful king. Number 3. The Kusanagi, which is a legendary Japanese sword and is one of 3. It was said to have come from the inside of a slain body of a serpent. The sword had the power to control the wind, allowing the one who wields it to direct a fierce wind in any direction. The original name of the sword means Sword of the Gathering Clouds of Heaven, but was later changed to the Grass-Cutting Sword. The reason given is that it was so sharp that it could be placed in a stream, and when grass was tossed upstream, it would be cut in half by the blade as it passed by. There's a shrine that dates back to 100 AD that houses the legendary sword today. Number 4. The Durandal is a legendary sword of Roland. Roland is said to be the nephew of the famous Holy Emperor Charlemagne. It's stated that the Durandal was given to Charlemagne by the angel of God, who instructed the emperor to give the sword to a member of his court, and it was given to his best warrior, Roland. The sword was so powerful it could cut through solid rock. Roland fought many battles with the sword later, and while holding off a large force in France on his own, and fearing he may have the sword taken from him, he threw it into a rock-covered cliff to prevent the sword from being captured. In later years, a church was built in the location, and the sword was replaced with a replica, while the real sword was hidden away from view. Number 5. The Cursed Muramatsas. It was said that the sword's maker was a genius and master at making blades, but he also had a very disturbed, ill-balanced mind verging on madness that was passed into his blades. They were popularly believed to hunger for blood and to influence their samurai owners to commit murder or suicide. The blades had such a bad reputation of driving samurai to even murder their own family members that the blades were banned by the Japanese shogun in 1603, though a famous Muramatsa is still known to exist in the Japanese museum. Number 6. The Hanjo Masamune was created by the greatest swordsmith in Japan. Not only were the Masamune swords known to be the best, but they were said to never cut the innocent and undeserving, and were thus deemed holy swords. The most revered of these swords was known as the Hanjo Masamune, and was owned by the Emperor of Japan, but was supposedly destroyed by the United States shortly after World War II, though it is widely believed that the sword became the personal possession of an individual in the United States military, instead of destroying the sword as instructed to do so. Number 7. Joyus. Some legends claim that Joyus was forged to contain the Spear of Destiny within its pommel, otherwise known as the spear that pierced Jesus on the cross. Others say that the blade was created from the same materials as Roland's Durandal sword, and originated from the same unearthly force, and as such has the same powers to cut through solid rock. The sword is said to now reside in a French museum, though it is also said that it is an old replica, and that the original is not on display. Number 8. The William Wallace Sword. is a sword of a Scottish knight who led a resistance to the English occupation of Scotland in 1270 AD. It is said that the sword's original scabbard, hilt, and belt were made from the dried skin of Hugh Cressingham, one of the English commanders, and was later replaced with cow leather. The William Wallace sword is known to be one of the longest and heaviest swords ever made. Number 9. St. Peter's sword is allegedly the sword with which the Apostle Peter cut off the ear of the high priest's servant at the time of Jesus' arrest. There are several legends about the sword, with one having it brought to England by Joseph of Arimathea, along with the Holy Grail, and it might be related to the story of the sword and the stone in Excalibur. Number 10. The Sword of Goujian, created from bronze sometime around 430 BC in China, and upon locating and unsheathing the sword in 1965, revealed an unusual untarnished blade. Despite the sword being soaked in underground water for over 2,000 years, it is renowned for its unusual sharpness and resilience to tarnish, rarely seen in artifacts so old. Upon further analysis, it was found to contain copper, tin, lead, iron, sulfur, and a trace amount of arsenic. The ancient script on the sword reveals that it was made for the king of Yule. The most unusual aspect to the sword is that it is still so sharp and strong that it could still be used in combat 2,000 years after its creation. Number 11. The Seven-Branched Sword was a gift by a king of Korea to the ruler of Japan around 2,000 years ago. But what is unusual is that the original manufacturing of the sword appears to have occurred in China and later transported to Korea. The sword is thought to have belonged to the legendary and mystical Japanese empress that reigned around 200 AD. The sword still has part of its gold inlaid inscription on its blade, and was thought to be used in ceremonies, but its full purpose is still a mystery. The sword is currently stored in a Japanese temple, and is not on display to the public. Number 12. Letizana was the sword of legendary hero El Cid. El Cid fought for both the Christian and Muslim armies in Spain. A Spanish museum claims to have the controversial sword, which is said to date around 1000 AD, but the evidence for the sword's authenticity has been inconclusive. The sword is said to be able to frighten away unworthy opponents at the very sight of it. Number 13. The Sword of Damocles. Damocles was a courtier in the court of the tyrant king Dionysius II of Syracuse, Sicily, during the 4th century BC. Damocles exclaimed that, as a great man of power and authority, King Dionysius was truly fortunate. King Dionysius offered to switch places with Damocles for a day, so he could taste firsthand that fortune. In the evening, a banquet was held where Damocles very much enjoyed being waited upon like a king. Only at the end of the meal did he finally look up and notice a sharpened sword hanging directly above his head by a single horsehair. Immediately he lost all taste for the amenities and asked to leave, saying he no longer wanted to be as fortunate as King Dionysius. It is presumed that the story is true and was designed to be a lesson that those who have power constantly live in fear of death. Number 14. The Zulfikar was owned by Ali, who was the best friend and son of the Prophet Muhammad. Some stories have emphasized its mystical abilities and speed, and was highly regarded as a weapon that could defend its owner from all adversaries. The sword is still said to exist, but is not on public display. Number 15. The Emerald-Studded Sword is a sword in the Persian legend of Amir Arsalan. In the legend, a witch mother of a hideous horned demon that used a charm to make its body invulnerable to all weapons except the blows of a specific sword called the Emerald-Studded Sword. This blade originally belonged to King Solomon and was carefully guarded because it was a valuable weapon and the only weapon that could harm the demon, but also because wearing it was a charm against magic. A wound inflicted by this sword could only be treated by a special potion. Number 16. Glory of 10 Powers Sword. The Glory of 10 Powers is a legendary Chinese sword, said to be created in Tibet by husband and wife magicians of the ancient Bon tradition. The love of the couple when creating the magical sword caused a great spirit to enter the weapon. The sword gained the power to protect the wearer using its magical powers. The sword is said to have been eventually captured and burned by the family's enemies, and the sword was made into a magic talisman. Number 17. The Claydnet Sword, also known as the Self-Swinging Sword and Asp the Serpent Sword in Russian folktales, and is said to have magical powers. This sword is said to be discovered hidden under a rock or under a sacred tree when a hero needs a powerful weapon. In the old stories, the sword will float in water, not heat up no matter how long it is left in fire, and can guide its owner's hand to make perfect strikes against their enemy. Number 18. The Sword of Attila was the legendary weapon carried by Attila the Hun in the 4th century AD. Oddly enough, the sword was said to have been found lying in a field by a shepherd after one of his flock injured itself by stepping on it. The shepherd dug it up and took it straight to Attila. Attila rejoiced at this gift, and being ambitious thought he had been appointed the ruler of the whole world, and that through this sword of God, supremacy in all wars were assured to him. A history of the sword potentially links it back to King Solomon's mother, though none of the old story can be substantiated. The same sword was also linked back to Charlemagne's sword, and it was rumored that Attila created the story about the sword being found in a field in order to hide the sword's true origins. No matter what the sword's origins were, Attila felt that receiving the sword divinely appointed him as a punisher by God. The sword thought to be owned by Attila the Hun is currently housed in a Vienna museum. Number 19. The Gram Sword. In Norse mythology, the Gram Sword, also translated as the Wrath Sword, was created by legendary Viking master blacksmith Völundr on behalf of the deity Odin. A mighty warrior named Sigmund received the sword after pulling it out of a tree where Odin had placed it. Later copies of the sword were named Ulfbert. Old blades bearing the name Ulfbert are found today and are kept in numerous museums, but what Ulfbert actually means has been lost to time. Number 20. Yellow Death Sword was the name given to Julius Caesar's sword. The British Prince Nennius acquired it during single combat with Caesar when it got stuck in his shield. Killed everyone Nennius struck with it. Nennius died 15 days after Caesar inflicted a head wound on him during battle, and the sword was buried with him. Number 21. The Dyern Wain, also known as the White Hilt, is said to be a powerful sword belonging to Diedrich Hale in 580 AD, who was one of the 3 generous men of Britain mentioned in the Welsh Triads. When the sword was drawn by a worthy man, the entire blade would blaze with fire. Diedrich was never reluctant to hand the weapon to anyone, hence his name Hale the Generous, but the recipients, as soon as they had learned of its peculiar properties, always rejected the sword. Number 22. The Turfing Sword was a magic sword in Norse mythology. The name is also used in a saga to denote the Goths, and was actually recorded by Roman sources in the 4th century. The sword's owner, King Sosferamai, was said to be Odin's grandson. The king managed to trap 2 dwarves, Dvalin and Durin, when they left the rock where they dwelt. He then forced them to forge a sword with a gold hilt that would never miss a stroke, would never rust, and would cut through stone and iron as easily through clothes. The dwarves made the sword, and it shone and gleamed like fire. However, in revenge they cursed it, so that it would kill a man every time it was drawn, and that it would be the cause of 3 great evils. The dwarves finally cursed it, so that it caused the king himself to die. Some of these stories might be more fiction than truth, but in other cases might be more truth than fiction. You be the judge of which is which. Remember to subscribe to this channel for free, and tune in tomorrow for more daily strange news. Don't forget to support our sponsors. Take care, and God bless.